The crystal wine glass caught the restaurant's warm lighting as my father stood up at the head of our family table. 23 relatives had gathered at Romano Chicago's most elegant Italian establishment to celebrate my promotion and upcoming move to Seattle. Everyone quieted, expecting the heartfelt toast a father gives his son before a major life transition. Dad cleared his throat, smiled that familiar, charming grin that had fooled me for 28 years, and delivered the words that shattered my world. Some kids make you proud. Others just take up space. Laughter erupted around the table as everyone assumed this was his typical dry humor, leading to genuine sentiment. But his eyes met mine with cold satisfaction, and I knew he meant every word. The laughter continued echoing in my ears as I forced my facial muscles into what I hoped resembled a smile. My throat felt like someone had poured concrete down it, but somehow I managed to respond with a voice that sounded steadier than I felt. Good thing I just got my own place 2,000 miles away. Don't worry, you'll never have to waste another thought on the disappointment again. More chuckles rippled through our extended family as they interpreted my response as quick wit, matching Dad's supposed joke. Aunt Patricia even applauded softly, clearly thinking we were engaging in some father-son banter that would lead to a touching moment. But I saw something flicker across Dad's face that told me he hadn't expected me to respond at all, let alone with such pointed accuracy. "Excuse me for just a moment," I said, standing up from my chair with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The bathroom seemed miles away as I walked past tables of other families enjoying normal celebrations, where fathers actually celebrated their children's successes. I locked the bathroom door behind me and gripped the marble sink until my knuckles turned white. The man staring back at me from the mirror looked exactly like the son who had sacrificed the last 3 years of his life caring for his widowed father. The same son who had moved back into his childhood bedroom after Mom died from breast cancer, who had managed Dad's complex diabetes medication schedule, who had driven him to countless doctor appointments when his eyesight started failing from diabetic retinopathy. The son who had turned down job offers in San Francisco, Austin, and New York because Dad claimed he couldn't manage alone. Who had handled Dad's accounting firm's books when his business started struggling after Mom's death, left him emotionally shattered. Who had quietly taken over the mortgage payments 18 months ago when Dad's client base dwindled and he couldn't admit his professional failures. I splashed cold water on my face and tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't some misguided attempt at humor. Dad had chosen the most public, humiliating moment possible to let me know exactly what he thought of me. In front of our entire extended family at a dinner celebrating my professional achievement, he had reduced me to something that merely occupies space. When I returned to the table, the conversation had moved on to Brandon's latest legal victory. My cousin sat comfortably in his usual position, as the family's golden child, regaling everyone with stories of his successful law practice. Dad beamed with pride as Brandon described winning a high-profile case, the same expression I had hoped to see when I announced my promotion to senior architect at one of Seattle's most innovative tech companies. That's when Uncle Marcus Dad's brother-in-law leaned over and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "Jeff, I've been meaning to ask you something privately. Your father's been telling us for months that you're having trouble finding direction in life. Says you're kind of a basement dweller who never really amounted to anything. But watching you tonight, that doesn't seem right at all." The words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus continued, his weathered face showing genuine concern. "He's been saying you live off his generosity and refuse to get a real job. Claims you spend most of your time playing video games and avoiding adult responsibilities. But something about that never sat right with me. You seem too together, too mature for that to be true." I stared across the table at Dad, who was still laughing at something Brandon had said, completely comfortable in his role as the proud father of the successful son. The realization crashed over me like ice water. This wasn't just tonight's cruel comment. Dad had been systematically destroying my reputation with our family for months painting me as a failure while I worked 60-hour weeks and supported him financially and emotionally. The Seattle job offer I had finally accepted wasn't just about career advancement. It was about escape from a situation I was only now beginning to understand had been carefully orchestrated. Dad hadn't been disappointed that I was leaving. He had been engineering my departure while ensuring I left with a damaged reputation that would make his narrative seem reasonable. As Marcus excused himself to visit the bar, I sat there watching Dad hold court with our family, realizing that everything I thought I knew about our relationship had been built on lies. The father I had sacrificed my 20s to care for had been using that time to systematically undermine me with the people who mattered most. I returned my attention to the table conversation, but now I was listening with completely different ears. Every interaction became a puzzle piece, and the picture they formed made me sick to my stomach. Aunt Patricia, Mom's older sister, turned to me with what I initially mistook for genuine interest. "Jeffrey, your father was telling me you're finally thinking about getting a real job. It's wonderful that you're starting to take some responsibility at your age." The words hit me like a slap. I worked as a senior software developer at TechFlow Solutions, a rapidly growing startup that had just landed contracts with 3 Fortune 500 companies. I'd been promoted to lead architect last month, a position that came with a salary increase to $95,000 annually and significant stock options. I regularly worked 60-hour weeks designing complex database architectures and managing a team of 12 junior developers. "I'm sorry, Aunt Patricia. What exactly did Dad tell you about my work situation?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. She looked puzzled, glancing between Dad and me. "Well, he said you refuse to get a real job and spend all day playing video games. He mentioned you've been struggling to find direction since you moved back home and that he's been supporting you because you won't take on adult responsibilities." The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade as I processed this information. Dad had been painting me as a basement-dwelling loser while I had been secretly paying his mortgage for 18 months. When his accounting practice nearly collapsed after he lost 3 major clients due to missed deadlines and poor communication, I had stepped in to prevent foreclosure on the house Mom had loved so much. Cousin Brandon, sitting directly across from me, jumped into the conversation with his typical arrogance. "Jeff, I have to say I admire Dad's patience with your situation. Not every father would be so understanding about an adult child who can't get their act together." Brandon was 2 years younger than me, but had always been Dad's favorite nephew. Where I was quiet and analytical, Brandon was loud and charismatic. Where I chose technology and innovation, Brandon chose law and traditional success markers that impressed our older relatives. Dad had spent years comparing us, always making sure I understood how Brandon's achievements overshadowed anything I might accomplish. "Brandon, what specifically has Uncle Robert told you about my situation?" I asked, using Dad's first name deliberately to create some emotional distance. Brandon's confident expression faltered slightly. "Well, he says you're basically a freeloader who refuses to contribute anything meaningful, that you live in his basement and expect him to support you while you waste time on hobbies instead of building a career." I lived in my childhood bedroom on the second floor of Dad's 2-story colonial, not the basement. I'd been paying utilities, groceries, and household maintenance costs for 3 years, while Dad told everyone he was supporting me. The hobbies Brandon referenced were actually my side projects in machine learning and artificial intelligence work that had directly led to my promotion and the Seattle job offer. Uncle Marcus returned from the bar with a fresh beer and an expression that suggested he had been doing some thinking. "Jeff, can I ask you something direct? What do you actually do for work?" "I'm a senior software architect at TechFlow Solutions. I design database systems for enterprise clients and manage a development team. I was just promoted to lead architect, which is why I'm moving to Seattle. They offered me a position heading up their new Pacific Northwest division." The silence that followed was deafening. Aunt Patricia's face went pale as she realized the disconnect between what Dad had told her and what I had just shared. Brandon looked confused, glancing at Dad for clarification that didn't come. Marcus set down his beer and fixed Dad with a steady stare. Robert, that doesn't match what you've been telling us about Jeff's situation. Dad's charming smile never wavered, but I caught a flash of something dangerous in his eyes. Jeff tends to exaggerate his role at that little company. It's not quite the position he makes it sound like. That's when the pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. Dad hadn't been mistaken or confused about my career. He had been deliberately misrepresenting my life to our family, while using my financial support to maintain his own lifestyle. The money I gave him for mortgage payments, medical expenses, and basic living costs had been funding a narrative where he was the generous father supporting his failure of a son. I thought about all the times over the past year when Dad had redirected conversations away from my work accomplishments. When I mentioned successful project launches, he would change the subject or diminish the achievement. When I talked about my team's innovations, he would make subtle jokes about playing on computers. I had assumed he simply didn't understand technology. Now I realized he had been protecting his version of reality. Dad, remember last Christmas when you bought Brandon's kids those expensive gaming systems, the ones that cost about $800 each? I asked innocently. Dad's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I wanted to give them something special. That was really generous, especially considering you were telling me you couldn't afford your diabetes medication that month. Good thing I was able to cover those prescription costs so you could be such a thoughtful great uncle. The table went quiet again. Brandon's face cycled through confusion, realization, and something that might have been shame. Aunt Patricia looked like she was mentally reviewing every conversation she'd had with Dad over the past year. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Dad with the calculating expression of someone who had spent 30 years as a successful contractor by reading people accurately. Robert, how exactly are you affording this lifestyle if Jeff isn't contributing and your business has been struggling? Dad's carefully constructed world was starting to crack, and I could see him scrambling for a response that would maintain his narrative without revealing the financial deception. But the math didn't work anymore. Everyone at the table was intelligent enough to add up the discrepancies. That's when Brandon delivered the final blow to my remaining illusions about family loyalty. He leaned forward with a smug expression that I now recognized as rehearsed satisfaction. Jeff, I hope you don't mind that Dad's been keeping me updated on your situation. He's been pretty worried about your resentment toward my success. He mentioned you've always been jealous that he has a son he can actually be proud of, and that it's been hard for you to accept that some people are just naturally more successful than others. The manipulation was breathtaking in its completeness. Dad hadn't just been destroying my reputation with extended family. He had been poisoning my relationship with Brandon by telling him I resented his success, while simultaneously telling me that Brandon thought I was a loser. He had been playing us against each other for years, ensuring that neither of us would compare notes about what he was telling each of us. I sat there looking at Brandon's satisfied face and realized that my cousin hadn't just been an innocent bystander in Dad's manipulation. He had been actively participating in it, enjoying the elevation that came from Dad's constant, unfavorable comparisons between us. The father I had spent 3 years caring for had been running a comprehensive campaign to isolate me from family support, while positioning himself as the long-suffering parent dealing with a disappointing child. And my own cousin had been complicit in the process, feeding on the favoritism Dad provided in exchange for validating his narrative about me. I excused myself again, but this time, I stepped outside onto the restaurant's covered patio. The Chicago autumn air cut through my shirt, but I needed the clarity that came with cold and space. I pulled out my phone and called Derek, my closest friend who still lived in our hometown. Derek, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What has my father been telling people about my situation? There was a long pause before Derek answered, and his hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Jeff, this is awkward, but since you're asking directly, your dad's been pretty vocal around town about your struggles. He's been telling people at church that you can't handle adult responsibilities and that he's worried about your maturity level. My stomach dropped. Dad had been spreading this narrative beyond our family to our entire community. What specifically has he been saying? He told Pastor Williams that you've been unable to hold down steady employment and that you lack motivation to build a real career. He mentioned to the guys at the golf club that you're going through some kind of extended adolescence where you can't commit to anything serious. And Mrs. Henderson from down the street asked me if it was true that you'd been having trouble adjusting to real-world expectations. I closed my eyes and leaned against the restaurant's brick wall. Dad had systematically destroyed my reputation with our neighbor's church community and his social circle. People I had known my entire life now viewed me as an immature failure who couldn't function independently. Derek, has anyone ever asked you directly about what I do for work? Actually, yeah. A few people seemed confused because they knew you were some kind of computer expert, but your dad's stories didn't match what they remembered about you. Walter from the golf club mentioned that your dad told him you'd finally found some entry-level work, which seemed weird because I remember you talking about managing people years ago. The manipulation was even more sophisticated than I had realized. Dad had been carefully crafting his lies to account for basic facts people already knew, positioning my obvious competence as recent development, rather than acknowledging 3 years of professional growth and success. I hung up with Derek and immediately opened my banking app to check my account statements. What I found made me physically nauseous. Over the past year, Dad had been withdrawing additional money beyond our agreed amounts for various emergencies. $300 for car repairs that never happened. $500 for medical bills that insurance had actually covered. $700 for home maintenance that I had ended up doing myself. While I scrolled through months of financial records, I realized Dad had been using my contributions to fund a lifestyle that supported his narrative of independence and success. The emergency withdrawals had paid for expensive dinners with clients he was supposedly courting, new golf equipment to maintain his image at the country club, and gifts for Brandon's family that reinforced Dad's position as the generous patriarch. I had been working 60-hour weeks and living like a monk to support a father who was using my money to finance the social connections he needed to maintain his lies about me. The irony was staggering. My financial responsibility was funding his campaign to portray me as financially irresponsible. When I returned to the table, Dad was in the middle of another story about Brandon's legal brilliance. I sat down quietly and began observing the family dynamics with new awareness. Every time someone asked about my life or career, Dad would either redirect the conversation or make subtle, undermining comments that shifted focus back to Brandon's achievements. "Jeff's been exploring some computer-related opportunities," Dad said, when Aunt Patricia asked about my Seattle move. "Hopefully he'll find something that works out this time." The dismissive phrasing turned my major career advancement into something tentative and uncertain. Dad had perfected the art of damning, with faint praise making my successes sound like lucky breaks rather than earned achievements. That's when Walter, Dad's golf partner, approached our table to say hello. I watched Dad's face carefully as Walter greeted me warmly. "Jeff Robert tells me you finally found some work in the computer field. That's wonderful news. It's good to see a young man getting serious about his career." The condescension in Walter's voice was clearly learned. He was repeating Dad's narrative that I had been unemployed or underemployed until recently. In Walter's mind, I was a 28-year-old man who had just gotten his first real job. "Actually, Walter, I've been working in software development for 6 years. I just got promoted to lead architect at my company, which is why I'm relocating to head up their new division in Seattle." Walter looked confused, glancing between Dad and me. "Oh, I thought Robert mentioned you were just getting started in the workforce?" Dad's smile became strained. "Jeff likes to make his work sound more important than it actually is. You know how young people exaggerate their roles these days." The casual dismissal hit me like a physical blow, but this time I was ready for it. I pulled out my phone and opened my LinkedIn profile, handing it to Walter. Here's my professional background if you're interested in the actual details. Walter's eyebrows rose as he read through 6 years of progressive career advancement technical certifications and professional accomplishments. His expression shifted from patronizing tolerance to genuine respect. And I watched Dad's face darken as his narrative crumbled in real time. This is quite impressive, Jeff. Lead architect is a significant position. You must be very proud of your son's achievements, Robert. Dad's forced laugh sounded hollow. Of course I'm proud. I just don't like to see him get ahead of himself with unrealistic expectations. But the damage to Dad's credibility was spreading. Uncle Marcus had been watching this entire exchange with growing suspicion, and I could see him mentally cataloging the discrepancies between Dad's stories and the evidence in front of him. As Walter returned to his own table, Brandon tried to restore the previous dynamic. Well, Jeff, I hope this Seattle thing works out better than your previous attempts at independence. The comment revealed how deeply Dad's manipulation had infected even my closest family relationships. Brandon genuinely believed I had a history of failed independence attempts because that's what Dad had been telling him for years. My cousin wasn't just being cruel, he was operating from completely false information that Dad had systematically fed him. I looked around the table at faces I had known and loved my entire life, realizing that none of them actually knew who I was anymore. Dad had spent months, maybe years, replacing their knowledge of me with his own carefully crafted fiction. I wasn't just fighting Dad's cruelty, I was fighting an entire alternate reality he had constructed where I was the problem child who had disappointed everyone. The son who had sacrificed his 20s to care for his widowed father had been erased and replaced with a caricature of failure and immaturity. And tomorrow when I left for Seattle, that caricature would be all they remembered of me. As the main course arrived, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to absorb Dad's subtle attacks and the family's condescending sympathy, I was going to start telling the truth. Not aggressively or defensively, but simply and factually. Dad, how have your diabetes management and doctor appointments been going lately? I asked conversationally while cutting my chicken. I know it was challenging when your eyesight started getting worse last year. Dad looked surprised by the question. It's been fine. I manage everything myself. That's great to hear. I remember when Dr. Peterson was adjusting your insulin dosages, you were having trouble remembering the new schedule. Good thing we got that organized with the pill dispenser system and the reminder alarms on your phone. Aunt Patricia looked interested. Robert, I didn't know you were having vision problems. You never mentioned that. Dad waved dismissively. Just some minor adjustments. Nothing serious. I nodded thoughtfully. The diabetic retinopathy can definitely be concerning, especially when it progresses to the point where driving becomes unsafe. I'm glad those eye injections Dr. Martinez recommended helped stabilize things. The table had gone quiet. Dad's medical struggles were news to most of our family because he had been presenting himself as completely healthy and independent while I managed his care behind the scenes. Uncle Marcus set down his fork. Robert, when did you develop vision problems severe enough to affect your driving? Jeff's exaggerating the situation, Dad said quickly. I had some minor eye irritation that required a few routine procedures. I pulled out my phone again and opened my calendar app. Dad, don't we have your follow-up appointment with the retinal specialist scheduled for next Tuesday? I can cancel that if your vision has improved enough that you don't need the monitoring anymore. Dad's face went red. Jeff, this isn't the time or place to discuss medical details. You're absolutely right, I agreed. I just want to make sure all your healthcare needs are covered before I move to Seattle. Speaking of which, should we review the household budget tonight or tomorrow morning? I want to make sure the transition to you handling all the expenses again goes smoothly. Brandon looked confused. What expenses? I thought Dad was supporting you. Actually, it's been the other way around for about 18 months, I said matter-of-factly. When Dad's accounting practice lost some major clients after Mom died, I took over the mortgage payments temporarily while he rebuilt his client base. We've been splitting utilities and groceries pretty evenly. The silence at the table was deafening. Dad had been caught in a direct contradiction of his own narrative, and there was no way to explain it away without admitting he had been lying about our financial arrangement. Aunt Patricia's voice was careful. Jeffrey, you've been paying Robert's mortgage, just helping out during a difficult transition period. I said, not wanting to humiliate Dad completely. It made sense for me to contribute while I was living there, especially since Dad was struggling with grief and some health challenges. But Dad couldn't let the narrative shift go unchallenged. Jeff makes it sound more significant than it actually was. I never needed his help. I was just allowing him to contribute to feel useful. That's when Uncle Marcus's patience finally ran out. Robert, stop. Just stop talking. Everyone turned to stare at Marcus, whose normally easygoing demeanor had shifted to something much more serious and authoritative. I've been watching this conversation tonight, and I've been watching your behavior for months. Something has felt wrong about your stories regarding Jeff, so I started paying attention to details and checking facts. Marcus pulled out his own phone and opened Facebook. 3 weeks ago, you posted pictures of your golf trip to Scottsdale. Beautiful resort, expensive-looking restaurants. 2 months ago, you shared photos of the new titanium driver you bought, bragging about spending top dollar for quality equipment. Dad's face went pale as Marcus continued scrolling. But during the same period, you've been telling family members that money is tight and that you can barely afford basic necessities because Jeff doesn't contribute anything meaningful. The evidence was damning. Dad's social media presence told the story of a comfortable middle-class lifestyle, complete with leisure activities and discretionary spending that contradicted his claims of financial struggle. Marcus, those posts don't tell the whole story, Dad protested weakly. Maybe not, Marcus agreed. So let's talk about the whole story. I did some checking with public records, Robert. Your business license shows that Hoffman Accounting Services has been operating consistently throughout this period. Your client base recovered 8 months ago when you landed that contract with the Medical Plaza downtown. My blood went cold. Dad's business had recovered 8 months ago, but he had continued accepting my mortgage payments while hiding his renewed financial stability. He had been taking money from me to maintain his lifestyle while telling everyone I was a financial burden. Marcus wasn't finished. I also cross-referenced your property tax records, Robert. This house has never been at risk of foreclosure. You've been current on all payments throughout the period Jeff claims he was helping with mortgage costs. The implication was staggering. Dad had either been lying about needing financial help, or he had been using my contributions for discretionary spending while maintaining his mortgage payments independently. Either way, he had been deceiving me about our financial arrangement while using my generosity to fund his attacks on my character. Brandon's face had gone white as he processed the implications. Uncle Robert, if your business recovered months ago, why did you tell me Jeff was still living off your charity? Dad tried various responses, but each explanation contradicted something else he had said. His carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling in real time, and our family was watching him scramble to maintain multiple false narratives simultaneously. That's when I delivered the final piece of evidence. I opened my banking app and showed the table 18 months of detailed financial records, mortgage payments, utility contributions, prescription copays, grocery expenses, and emergency withdrawals that totaled over $40,000. Dad, since your memory of our financial arrangement seems unclear, maybe this will help clarify things for everyone. The documented proof was irrefutable. Line by line, transaction by transaction, the records showed exactly how much I had been contributing to Dad's household while he told everyone I was financially irresponsible and lived off his generosity. Aunt Patricia stared at the screen in shock. Brandon looked like he was going to be sick. Uncle Marcus shook his head slowly, the disappointment in his eyes unmistakable. Dad's facade finally cracked completely. Instead of acknowledging the deception, or apologizing for the lies he lashed out with vicious honesty. Fine, you want the truth, Jeff has always been a disappointment. He's never lived up to his potential, never made me proud the way Brandon does. Everything he touches turns mediocre, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise. Moving to Seattle won't change the fact that he's fundamentally inadequate. The raw cruelty in Dad's voice silenced the entire restaurant section. This wasn't manipulation or strategic deception anymore. This was pure, undisguised contempt for his own son delivered in front of the people who mattered most to both of us. But something strange happened as Dad's words hung in the air. Instead of feeling destroyed, I felt liberated. After years of wondering what I'd done wrong of trying to earn approval that would never come, I finally understood that the problem had never been me. I looked around the table at my family's horrified faces and realized they were seeing Dad's true character for the first time. The charming, grieving widower who had been struggling to raise a difficult son was revealed as a manipulative man who had been systematically destroying his child's reputation to serve his own emotional needs. The silence following Dad's outburst stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Our waiter approached hesitantly, clearly sensing the tension, but Uncle Marcus waved him away with a subtle gesture. Marcus set his phone on the table and looked directly at Dad. "Robert, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you because your family's future depends on your response." Dad's face still held traces of the vicious satisfaction he had shown while attacking me. But uncertainty was creeping in, as he realized Marcus wasn't backing down. "For the past 6 months, I've been documenting your behavior because something felt fundamentally wrong about your treatment of Jeff. I'm a contractor, Robert. My job requires me to assess situations accurately and identify problems before they become disasters. Your stories about Jeff never added up." Marcus opened his photo gallery and began scrolling through screenshots. "Here's a text message you sent me 3 months ago complaining that Jeff refuses to take responsibility for his life and expects you to support him indefinitely. Here's a Facebook comment from 2 months ago where you told Charlie Morrison that Jeff lacks the maturity to handle adult relationships." Brandon leaned forward to look at the phone screen, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and growing horror as he realized the scope of Dad's deception. Marcus continued methodically. "Here's a photo you posted on Instagram showing off that expensive watch you bought last month with a caption about treating yourself when you've earned success through hard work. This was posted the same week you told Aunt Patricia that money was tight because Jeff doesn't contribute to household expenses." Aunt Patricia's hand went to her mouth. "Robert, you told me Jeffrey was bleeding you dry financially. You said you couldn't afford new furniture because you were supporting an adult child who wouldn't work." "Here's where it gets interesting," Marcus said, pulling up another screenshot. "I cross-referenced your business income with public contracts. Hoffman Accounting Services has been doing quite well. You landed that Medical Plaza account plus 2 restaurant chains and a small manufacturing company. Your monthly income has been higher this year than it was before Sandra died." The name of my mother hung in the air like an accusation. Dad had been using Mom's death and his grief as cover for financial manipulation and emotional abuse, turning his tragedy into a tool for controlling and undermining me. Marcus wasn't finished. But the most interesting discovery was this conversation I had with Dr. Peterson's office when I called to ask about coordination of care for Jeff's move to Seattle. Dad went completely still and I felt my stomach drop. Marcus had been investigating Dad's medical situation independently. Imagine my surprise when Dr. Peterson's nurse told me that Jeff has been listed as Robert's primary emergency contact and healthcare proxy for the past 2 years. She mentioned how impressed the staff has been with Jeff's dedication to his father's care, especially his meticulous tracking of medication schedules and symptoms. The revelation hit our family like a bomb. Dad had been portraying himself as completely independent, while I managed his healthcare behind the scenes. The nurse's comments revealed a level of involvement and responsibility that contradicted everything Dad had told everyone about our relationship. The nurse also mentioned that Jeff had already arranged for a professional care coordinator to take over his responsibilities when he moves to Seattle, and that he had prepaid for 6 months of service to ensure continuity of care. I'd been so focused on ensuring Dad's health and safety during my transition to Seattle that I hadn't realized how my preparations contradicted his narrative of independence. The care coordinator, the prepaid services, the detailed medical records I had organized, all of it proved that Dad needed significant support that he had been hiding from our family. Brandon's voice was barely a whisper. "Uncle Robert, you told me Jeff was irresponsible and couldn't handle taking care of anyone, including himself." Dad tried to speak, but Marcus held up his hand. "I'm not done. The most damaging evidence isn't financial or medical. It's psychological." Marcus turned to face Dad fully. "I've been talking to people, Robert. Really talking to them, asking follow-up questions, checking details. You've been telling different versions of the same stories to different people, always positioning yourself as the victim and Jeff as the problem." He began listing specific examples with devastating precision. "You told Pastor Williams that Jeff has anger management issues and that you're concerned about his emotional stability. You told the men at your golf club that Jeff lacks motivation and expects everything handed to him. You told your neighbors that Jeff has trouble maintaining relationships because he's immature and selfish." Each revelation felt like a physical blow. Dad had been systematically destroying my reputation with character assassination that went far beyond laziness or financial irresponsibility. He had been questioning my mental health, emotional stability, and basic human decency. "But here's what makes it particularly insidious," Marcus continued. "You've been telling Jeff completely different stories about what these same people think of him. You've been isolating him by making him believe his family and community have already judged him negatively." The manipulation was breathtaking in its comprehensiveness. Dad hadn't just been lying about me to others. He had been lying to me about what others thought, creating a prison of social isolation that made me dependent on his approval and afraid to reach out for support. Brandon suddenly spoke up, his voice shaking. "Uncle Robert, you told me that Jeff resented my success and that he had made bitter comments about our family always preferring me. You said Jeff felt entitled to the same level of achievement without putting in the same effort." My cousin's face was pale as he processed the implications. "But you never told me any of this in front of Jeff. You only shared these concerns privately, making me feel like I needed to be careful around him because he was jealous and potentially unstable." The room felt like it was spinning as the full scope of Dad's psychological manipulation became clear. He had been playing family members against each other for years, creating false conflicts and imaginary resentments that justified his differential treatment while preventing us from comparing notes about what he was telling each of us. Aunt Patricia's voice was barely audible. "Robert, you told me that Jeff had made cruel comments about how much easier his life would be when you die. You said you were worried about his lack of empathy and his resentment toward your grief over Sandra's death." The accusation was so shocking and vicious that I couldn't even process it initially. Dad had told my mother's own sister that I was essentially waiting for him to die so I could inherit his assets without the burden of caring for him. He had turned my mother's memory into a weapon against me. "Those conversations never happened," I said quietly. "I have never not once said or thought anything like that." Uncle Marcus nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I suspected. Robert, you've been conducting a systematic campaign of character assassination against your own son. You've been isolating him from family support, undermining his professional accomplishments, questioning his mental health, and destroying his relationships with people who love him." The table sat in stunned silence as the full enormity of Dad's behavior sank in. This wasn't just cruel parenting or misguided attempts at motivation. This was calculated psychological warfare designed to maintain control and justify emotional abuse. Dad finally tried to respond, but his voice was weak and defensive. Everyone's misunderstanding the situation. Jeff has always been sensitive and prone to exaggeration. I've been trying to help him develop realistic expectations. But the evidence was too comprehensive and too well documented for anyone to believe his explanations anymore. Marcus had systematically dismantled 3 years of lies with facts, dates, financial records, and testimony from multiple independent sources. "Robert," Marcus said with finality, "you've been gaslighting your own son while conducting a public relations campaign to destroy his reputation. You've been using his grief over his mother's death, his dedication to your care, and his financial generosity as tools to manipulate and control him." The truth hung in the air like a judgment, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe clearly. The problem had never been me. The disappointment, the inadequacy, the constant sense that I was failing to meet expectations, all of it had been artificially created and maintained by someone who was supposed to love and protect me. Dad's carefully constructed world had collapsed completely, and our family was finally seeing him clearly for the first time since Mom died. I sat back in my chair and felt something shift inside me that I hadn't experienced in 3 years. For the first time since Mom's funeral, I felt completely calm and absolutely certain about what needed to happen next. "Thank you, Uncle Marcus," I said quietly. "I appreciate you taking the time to investigate this situation. It means more than you know to have someone actually check the facts instead of just accepting Dad's version of events." I turned to address each family member individually, speaking with the kind of calm clarity that comes from finally understanding a situation completely. "Aunt Patricia, I want you to know that I have never once expressed resentment about Dad's grief over Mom's death. Losing her was devastating for all of us, and I would never minimize his pain or suggest that caring for him was a burden. I moved back home because I wanted to help, not because I felt obligated or trapped." Aunt Patricia's eyes filled with tears as she realized how thoroughly she had been manipulated into believing I lacked empathy for Dad's loss. "Brandon, I've never expressed jealousy about your success or made any bitter comments about our family's pride in your achievements. Your accomplishments are impressive, and I've always respected your dedication to your career. Dad has been telling both of us that the other feels resentful, which prevented us from having honest conversations about our actual relationship." Brandon looked sick as he understood how Dad had poisoned our relationship by creating imaginary conflicts between us. "Uncle Marcus, the business about my job situation is straightforward. I'm a senior software architect at TechFlow Solutions, earning $95,000 annually with significant stock options. I manage a team of 12 developers and have been promoted 3 times in 6 years. The Seattle position is heading up a new division with a starting salary of $130,000 plus equity." I pulled out my phone and showed them my official offer letter from the Seattle company, letting them see the actual terms of employment rather than Dad's diminished version of my career prospects. "The financial situation is also straightforward. I've been contributing approximately $2,200 monthly to this household for 18 months, covering mortgage payments, utilities, groceries, and Dad's medical expenses. The total contribution is just over $40,000, all documented in my banking records." The precision of the numbers made it impossible for Dad to claim I was exaggerating or misremembering our arrangement. Regarding Dad's health situation, he has diabetic retinopathy that requires regular monitoring and occasional procedures. His medication schedule is complex, and his eyesight limitations make driving challenging in certain conditions. I've been managing his healthcare coordination, but I've arranged for a professional care service to take over when I move to Seattle. Each factual statement directly contradicted a specific lie Dad had told, and our family could see the systematic nature of his deception laid out like evidence in a courtroom. The reason I finally accepted the Seattle job offer isn't just career advancement. It's because I realized that no matter what I accomplish or contribute here, it will never be enough to earn the respect and acknowledgement I've been hoping for. Dad needs me to be a failure to justify his treatment of me, which means my success will always be minimized or reframed as inadequacy. Brandon finally spoke up, his voice shaking. Jeff, I owe you a massive apology. I've been participating in this without realizing it. Uncle Robert convinced me that you resented my relationship with him, so I started treating you like you were jealous and bitter. I should have talked to you directly instead of believing his interpretation of your feelings. I appreciate that, Brandon. But I want you to understand something important. Dad didn't accidentally create this situation. He systematically fed us contradictory information about each other's attitudes and feelings, ensuring that we would remain distant while he maintained control over both relationships. Uncle Marcus leaned forward with an expression I recognized from his successful contracting business. Jeff, I want to make you an offer. I've been so impressed with how you've handled this situation tonight, and frankly, with the character you've shown throughout this entire ordeal, that I'd like to explore a business partnership. Dad's face went white as Marcus continued. I'm expanding into commercial property management, and I need someone with your analytical skills and technological background to develop the systems and processes. It would be a significant equity position with substantial growth potential. The offer was completely unexpected and represented exactly the kind of recognition and opportunity I'd been hoping Dad might someday provide. Instead, it was coming from someone who had taken the time to observe my actual character and capabilities. That's incredibly generous, Uncle Marcus. I'm committed to this Seattle position, but I'd love to explore ways we might collaborate in the future. Aunt Patricia reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Jeffrey, I'm so sorry I believed Robert's stories without questioning them. I should have trusted my instincts about your character instead of accepting secondhand information about your attitudes and behavior. Aunt Patricia, you weren't given accurate information to work with. Dad is very persuasive, and he's had 3 years to craft these narratives carefully. That's when Dad made his final desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. This is ridiculous. Jeff is manipulating all of you with his sob story. He's always been good at playing the victim when he doesn't get his way. But something had fundamentally shifted in our family dynamic. Nobody was looking at Dad with the respect and deference he had enjoyed for years. Instead, they were looking at him with a mixture of disappointment, disgust, and something that looked like pity. Dad, I said quietly, I'm going to give you an opportunity to handle this with whatever dignity you have left. I'm leaving for Seattle in 2 weeks instead of 4. Since you find my presence so burdensome, and since your business has recovered enough to support your lifestyle independently, this arrangement works out perfectly for both of us. Dad's face cycled through panic as he realized I was withdrawing my financial and emotional support immediately. Jeff, you can't just abandon your responsibilities. I need time to adjust my budget and arrange alternative care options. I've already arranged everything, I replied calmly. The care coordinator I hired will start Monday. Your business income is sufficient to cover all household expenses without my contributions. Your healthcare is completely organized and prepaid through the transition period. The panic in Dad's eyes revealed the truth about our relationship more clearly than any of his words ever had. He didn't love me or value me as his son. He needed me as his caregiver, financial contributor, and emotional punching bag. Losing me meant losing the support system that enabled his comfortable lifestyle and social status. You can't just leave like this, Dad said desperately. What will people think? Uncle Marcus answered with cold precision. They'll think that Jeff finally stood up for himself after years of emotional abuse. They'll think he showed remarkable restraint and maturity in handling a situation that would have destroyed most people's mental health. I stood up from the table feeling lighter than I had in 3 years. I'll be back tomorrow to pack my belongings and finalize the care arrangements. After that, our communication will be limited to essential matters only. Dad made one last attempt at manipulation. Jeff, you're going to regret this. Family is all you have, and you're throwing it away over a misunderstanding. I looked around the table at the faces of people who finally understood what had been happening, and who were looking at me with respect, love, and admiration for the first time in years. Dad, I'm not throwing away family. I'm finally finding it. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my new apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, looking out at the Space Needle and Elliott Bay through floor-to-ceiling windows that still amazed me every morning. The apartment was small but modern, with hardwood floors and enough natural light to make my houseplants thrive for the first time in years. My phone buzzed with a text from Uncle Marcus. "Family dinner tonight. Dad's not joining us anymore. We'd love to have you video call in if you're free around 7 your time." The family dynamic had shifted dramatically in the 2 weeks since the restaurant confrontation. Dad had become increasingly isolated as family members processed the full scope of his manipulation and chose to distance themselves from his toxic behavior. Uncle Marcus had emerged as a natural family leader, organizing gatherings that focused on honest communication and genuine support. I opened my laptop and joined the video call right at 7, seeing familiar faces arranged around Uncle Marcus's dining room table. Aunt Patricia waved enthusiastically, Brandon smiled sheepishly, and several cousins I hadn't spoken to in months looked genuinely happy to see me. "Jeff, how's Seattle treating you?" Aunt Patricia asked with warmth that felt completely different from the patronizing sympathy she had shown me for years. "It's incredible," I said honestly. "The job is everything I hoped it would be. I'm working with brilliant people on projects that actually challenge me, and the company culture is collaborative instead of competitive." Brandon leaned into the camera. "Jeff, I've been meaning to tell you something. I talked to Dad last week, and he tried to continue the same manipulation tactics with me. He wanted me to tell you that the family misses you and hopes you'll come to your senses about your career choices." "How did you respond?" I asked, curious about how Brandon was handling Dad's continued attempts at control. "I told him that your career choices are clearly excellent, and that the only person who needs to come to their senses is him. I also told him that I'm proud to have a cousin with your integrity and strength." The words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had craved exactly this kind of recognition from family members who actually knew and valued who I was. Uncle Marcus cleared his throat. "Jeff, I want to give you an update on some things that have developed since you left. Your father has been trying to contact people to rebuild his narrative, but it's not working anymore." "What do you mean?" "He called Pastor Williams to complain that you had turned the family against him and that you were spreading lies about his character. But Pastor Williams had already talked to Dr. Peterson's office about coordination of care for your move, so he knew the truth about your role in Robert's healthcare." Marcus continued with obvious satisfaction. "Pastor Williams told Robert that the church community has been impressed with your dedication to family responsibilities and that they're excited about your career success. He suggested Robert might benefit from counseling to address his apparent resentment toward your achievements." The image of Dad trying to manipulate our pastor, only to discover that his lies had already been exposed, felt like perfect justice. "There's more," Aunt Patricia added. "Robert tried to get sympathy from the neighbors by claiming you had abandoned your responsibilities when he needed you most. But Mrs. Henderson had already heard about your careful arrangements for his care and your generous advance payments for services. I learned that Dad's social manipulation network had completely collapsed once people started comparing his different versions of events. The contradictions became impossible to ignore when community members began talking to each other instead of relying solely on Dad's carefully filtered information. The golf club situation was particularly satisfying," Marcus added with a grin. "Walter and the other guys started asking direct questions about Robert's finances after they realized his claims about supporting you didn't match your obvious success and independence." "What happened?" "They figured out that Robert had been using your financial contributions to fund his golf club membership and expensive equipment while claiming he was struggling financially. The guys don't appreciate being lied to about money, especially when the lies were designed to generate sympathy and special treatment. The systematic collapse of Dad's social manipulation felt like watching justice unfold naturally. He had built his comfortable lifestyle and community standing on lies about me, and those lies were proving impossible to maintain once people had accurate information. My phone rang during the family call, and I saw Derek's name on the screen. "Excuse me for just a second, everyone." "Jeff, you're not going to believe what just happened," Derek said without preamble. "Your father showed up at my apartment asking me to help him reach out to Jeff because he's concerned about your mental state and thinks you're making impulsive decisions that will hurt your future." I put Derek on speaker so the family could hear. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that you're the most mentally healthy person I know, and that your decision to move to Seattle was obviously well-planned and professionally beneficial. I also told him that if anyone in your family needs mental health support, it's probably the person who spent years lying about their son's character and achievements." The family burst into laughter at Derek's blunt response. Even 6 months ago, such direct criticism of Dad would have felt uncomfortable and disloyal. Now it felt like appropriate accountability for destructive behavior. "Derek, there's something else you should know," I said. "Dad has been systematically lying about me to our entire community for years. The stories about me being unmotivated and financially irresponsible were completely fabricated." "Yeah, I figured that out," Derek replied. "Your dad's reputation around town has taken a serious hit since people started comparing notes about his stories. Turns out a lot of people had doubts about his version of events, but didn't want to question a grieving widower's judgment about his own son." After I hung up with Derek, Uncle Marcus delivered the news I had been hoping for. "Jeff, your father, has stopped contacting family members to complain about you or try to rebuild his narrative. I think he's finally realized that his manipulation tactics don't work anymore." "How is he doing overall?" I asked, because despite everything, I was still concerned about his basic well-being. "He's fine," Aunt Patricia said, matter-of-factly. "His business is doing well. His health is stable with the care coordinator you arranged, and he has plenty of social connections if he chooses to maintain them honestly. He's just learning to live without the emotional control and financial support he took for granted." Brandon leaned forward. "Jeff, I want to tell you something important. Watching how you handled this situation taught me a lot about integrity and strength. You never attacked Dad personally or tried to turn people against him. You just told the truth and let people draw their own conclusions. You also never stopped ensuring his practical needs were met, even after discovering how he had betrayed your trust," Uncle Marcus added. "The care coordinator, the prepaid services, the organized medical records, you handled your responsibilities with more maturity than Robert showed throughout this entire situation. 6 months later, I was thriving in Seattle beyond anything I had imagined possible. My work at the tech company had exceeded all expectations, and I had been selected to lead an innovative machine learning project that would define the company's future direction. I was dating Sarah, a brilliant biomedical engineer who appreciated my analytical mind and found my dedication to family, even difficult family, to be admirable rather than pathetic. On a rainy Saturday evening, I video called into another family gathering this time to celebrate Brandon's engagement to his longtime girlfriend. The dynamic was warm, supportive, and genuinely joyful in a way that our family gatherings had never been when Dad's manipulation poisoned the atmosphere. "Jeff, we have some news about your father that you should probably hear," Uncle Marcus said after the engagement celebration had wound down. "Is he okay?" "He's fine physically. But he's been going to counseling, apparently. Pastor Williams strongly recommended it after Robert continued trying to manipulate church members into taking sides in family conflicts." Aunt Patricia nodded. "The counselor apparently helped Robert understand that his behavior toward you was emotionally abusive and that his grief over Sandra's death doesn't excuse systematic manipulation and character assassination. Has he said anything about wanting to repair our relationship?" Marcus and Patricia exchanged a look. "He's asked several times about how to contact you. But we've told him that the initiative for any reconciliation has to come from you. You're the injured party, and you get to decide if and when you're ready for that conversation. I thought about it for a long moment. The anger and hurt had faded over the months, replaced by a clarity about what healthy relationships require and what I'm willing to accept in my life. I'm open to rebuilding some kind of relationship with Dad eventually, I said finally. But it would have to be based on honesty, mutual respect, and acknowledgement of what actually happened. I won't pretend the manipulation didn't occur or accept partial apologies that minimize the damage. That seems reasonable and mature, Brandon said. For what it's worth, I think Dad is finally understanding the scope of what he did and why it was so damaging. As I ended the video call and looked out at the Seattle skyline, I reflected on the life lesson that had emerged from this painful experience. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who damage you the most systematically. True love doesn't require you to diminish yourself to make someone else feel superior. Healthy relationships celebrate your successes rather than minimizing them to protect someone else's ego. I had learned that you cannot earn respect from people who need you to fail for their own emotional stability. Dad's cruelty hadn't been about my inadequacies. It had been about his inability to handle my competence and independence. Moving away from toxic relationships. Even family relationships isn't abandonment. It's self-preservation and an investment in your own potential. The most important realization was that family should be a source of strength and support, not a constant test of your worthiness for basic human dignity. Real family celebrates your growth, supports your dreams, and treats your achievements as causes for joy rather than threats to their own significance. 3 years after that devastating dinner at Romano's, I was living the life I had always wanted but never thought I deserved. I had challenging work that utilized my skills, authentic relationships based on mutual respect, and the emotional space to become the person I was meant to be, rather than the diminished version someone else needed me to remain. Dad's cruel toast had been intended to humiliate and control me, but it had actually freed me by forcing me to see our relationship clearly. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives create the opening for the best changes we'll ever make. The kid who just took up space had found his place in the world, and it was better than I had ever dared to imagine. What about you? Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where your successes were minimized or your contributions went unrecognized? How did you find the strength to demand the respect you deserved? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please consider giving it a like and sharing it with someone who might benefit from hearing about the importance of setting boundaries with toxic family members. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming manipulation and finding your authentic path in life. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that you deserve relationships that celebrate your growth rather than punish it. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who need you to stay small and build a life that honors the person you're truly meant to become.